Elizabeth, Dr. Kilbey, thank you so much for joining the Hurt Healing podcast today. It's a real honour to have you on, and I'm incredibly excited about this conversation about technology and why we need to unplug the younger generation.
Yep. Yeah.
So to start with, what inspired you to write Parenting Unplugged, and could you briefly share the key learnings and themes in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It's very timely because I began the research prior to the pandemic, and I think that's an important time point because the world was different then. And even back then, I was seeing in my clinical practice, in the families that I work with, lots of conversations about devices, device uses, parents asking me lots of questions like, at what age, or what sorts of games, or is it detrimental, is it causing ADHD? And then lots of conversations about how to manage boundaries around devices. I can't, when to use them. My child won't come off. It's causing lots of friction, all of those kind of things. And I found myself having similar conversations a lot, which made me think probably this is a topic that's relevant to a lot of parents.
Can you explain, because in your book you refer a lot to latency age children.
Yeah.
So let's just start off by defining what latency age children is and means.
So we can divide childhood broadly into 3 chunks. So we have infancy, and that's the bit that most people are familiar with. Really high dependency, lots of care needs. Children can't do lots of things for themselves. And that, as with all developmental stages, it's not neatly defined by exact timestamps, but kind of roughly we're talking about the age before children begin school. And they're going through a whole really rapid development, but they really are largely dependent upon you. They're beginning to feel their way with their autonomy, lots of I do it and no and things like that. But that doesn't last very long because there's lots of things they can't do. So very quickly they fall back onto needing you. And once they move beyond that and they start to get enough autonomy to do basic self-care and dressing and feeding themselves and those kind of things, they move into a sort of kind of middle stage of childhood that we call latency. And what I really love about the concept of latency is I think of it like the garden in winter, right? It all looks a bit dormant and like not a lot's happening. And sort of developmentally, it feels like these children are in this sort of lovely middle phase for quite a while, and things are often a bit easier. You can converse with them more easily, you can negotiate with them, they have an understanding of more complex things. It's a bit it's a bit more collaborative, and they're really interested in things, and this is where all the playground crazes come in. If you remember those things that people used to collect in school, and they become a little bit obsessional and a little bit sort of like all of their order and neatness. They get quite concerned with rules. I love that bit, quite moralistic and everyone doing everything right and wrong, but they're still very much dependent and sort of entrenched in the family system. And I think of it as the sort of winter of child development, because not a lot's going on above ground, but a lot is going along below ground, and they are storing up energy for what's to come, because what's to come is adolescence, and that is a unique storm of its own. And so adolescence is about independence and autonomy and differentiating and breaking away from family values and ideologies and affiliating to your peer group. And it's that real pull and push of kind of the journey out of your family into being autonomous. So adolescence is definitely stormy, and latency is that sort of lovely emotional money in the bank bit that comes beforehand when your children are really delightful. So when you're in adolescence, you can remember that they were once delightful and know that they will return to being delightful again to help weather the storm that you're going through.
Okay, that's very clear. So the age of sort of Pokemon cards and oh my god, what yo-yos and all that. I remember so that's the sort of latency age. Absolutely. And they're they're a delight. They're really engaging, and they're humorous, lovely jokes, and kind of a lot of slapstick humour, a lot of kind of play on words, all of that kind of funniness. But they're still easily within a routine, and that real middle chunk of childhood. Okay, so we're talking roughly probably between the ages of what, like 7 and 12?
Yeah, so kind of starting school age, because that's such a big leap for independence. You discover that the world is bigger than just your family, which is kind of genuinely mind-blowing for small children. And then all the way through kind of primary school to the kind of emergence of adolescence. And what we're seeing, I think, sort of generationally speaking, that sort of, it's very interesting to think where that threshold of adolescence starts, because in terms of physical development,
we're absolutely seeing adolescence beginning at sort of younger and younger ages. But kind of emotionally and developmentally, childhood is actually extended. If I think that my parents went out to work at 15, which was completely normal, that wasn't, that was absolutely when you sort of left school and entered the job market and had sort of proper grown-up jobs. That just isn't what we do now. So children continue in education until 18, and then extended education, and then sort of moving into the... So emotionally, the sort of journey of childhood really is sort of stretched and elongated. I think what that means is you've just got a longer adolescence. You're still going into it at kind of 12, 13, 14. And then it's actually quite a long time until you sort of tip out into adulthood. It's a really... I think it's a really sort of fascinating developmental stage.
Yeah, no, I do too. And I mean, this is why your book's so fascinating, because essentially now, by giving children devices at such a young age, and during this latency period, we're actually almost truncating that period, and we're almost elongating adolescence and making them grow up way too quickly because they're exposed to so much more on their devices. I mean, I think... I completely agree. I think something happens when you sort of broaden children's horizons. And, I'm really clear when I start talking about devices and children and development. I don't sit in a sort of good or bad or demonising or right or wrong way. I'm just really interested in the differences and what that's now doing to the developmental journey. And I think absolutely giving children devices does something about exposing them to the kind of interactions and the social arena at an age where probably developmentally they're not ready, because they wouldn't normally. If you live, you go to a local school, 1, 2, 3, 4 elementary school, that's the amount of children really that you're kind of exposed to day by day. You've got your family networks and those kind of things. But it's still a relatively small, contained network. If you suddenly realise the reach or the power of devices and social media and that instant connectivity, we really are kind of accelerating the amount of contact that children at that age can be exposed to. And I think developmentally, certainly from my clinical experience, they are often ill-equipped to cope with that jump. Yeah, and we'll move on to discussing this further, but I mean, you can't help but then think that it's due the direct correlation with the rise in mental health issues amongst youngsters, because their brains are just overwhelmed. Why do we think things like ADHD are on the rise? Well, unfortunately, we have to look at one big change, and one big change over the last, say, 10 to 15 years has been giving children media devices much, much earlier.
I would completely agree with the stat that our evidence shows us that the mental health of young people is probably worse than it's been, or certainly recorded to be worse than it's been for a really long time. And it's definitely multifaceted. I think the pandemic has been a fascinating experience. I mean, I'm using fascinating instead of a lot of other adjectives in terms of what that's done to young people's experiences, really. And we are seeing definitely worse mental health post-pandemic, and that, I think, that's a myriad of factors were involved in that. But I would agree that childhood feels very different. If I think about my childhood and then I think about the childhood of my parents, every generation talks about it not being like it was in my day, but it does feel like there's a real qualitative shift between what I grew up with as sort of cultural norms versus what my children experience. And I think that's really, there's a specific reason why that's really important, because when we parent, no one has the handbook on that, right? But what we do is we take our own lived experience and we take from that what we particularly valued and things that we would really like to change, and that's what we tend to pass down, and it becomes like a blueprint, if you like. So if I think about my parents' blueprint of parenting and how they were parented and how they would have then passed that down to me, definitely some tweaks and changes, but a lot of that felt very similar. If I think about my experiences of being parented and then the kind of challenges that I faced parenting my own children, I can't draw on my own lived experience to guide me. I didn't get a mobile phone until I was 22. It's a very interesting topic in my house. My children ask me questions like, when I was studying or when I was at university, how did I find anybody if I didn't have a mobile phone to Snapchat map them and find out where they were, or to text people? And they genuinely can't conceptualise what day-to-day lived experience was like. Now, if I had a similar conversation with my parents about, how I would find people when I was young, I would go up and down the street and knock on the door, and they would have done something largely similar. It doesn't feel like it's that qualitative gear shift. And so for me, something really profound has changed in the way that we're asking parents to parent. without giving them a set of experiences or skills to work from. And I think that's why we're getting into tricky territory.
Exactly. And we were having an interesting conversation before we started this recording about my friends who are probably 10 years younger than you and your contemporaries, and the fact that a lot of them are making a conscious decision not to give devices to their children, because I think we were exposed to them in our teens and adolescence, but I think now that there's more awareness around the detrimental effects of handing children devices at a young age, that actually they're really erring on the side of caution, whereas I'd say your generation were a bit more flippant and didn't really recognise the hazards of handing children the devices early on.
I mean, I do wonder, absolutely. You know, my experience and my contemporaries' experience of having phones was probably not until they were in adulthood. So we have absolutely no lived experience of what having a device as a child was like, what that did to our relationships with people, what that did to our sort of connectivity in the world. So I think absolutely there's a huge knowledge gap that's kind of driving that. And it's the technology and the kind of device experience is moving so rapidly. That's one of the things that technology does. It really speeds things up. So even in the sort of course of the lifespan of my children, I've seen a phenomenal amount change. So I think we're starting with parents, adults who are already in a knowledge gap in a space where things are moving really fast. And how do we equip people to give them information, to help them make the right choices, to help them parent the way that they want to parent? Because I think that's one of the things I really notice when people talk about devices. What I sense is this tension between the pattern or the life or the way that they're doing it in relation to the device and what they want to do. People have often got a good idea of how they would like it to be. Sometimes it's a bit nostalgic and a bit kind of, a bit wistful about back in the old days. But parents often have a good idea, and what they're struggling with is the hurdles and the barriers that come up.
Exactly. I mean, why do you think that the use of media devices has increased so rapidly amongst the young, and why are parents handing children devices at such an early age? I mean,
I think it's really, that's a really good question. It has to be something about availability and accessibility. I remember researching for the book. I mean, the stats was like something like 90% of children of primary school age have access to a device of some kind. So absolutely the availability and the sort of ease, the intuitiveness with which children can take to devices. I mean, it is a complete joke, and I find it to be very true. If I'm struggling with something with technology, I kind of find a teenager, because they're just going to know how to do it. So it's that we call that digital natives. They've grown up exposed to technology. It's intuitive to them. It's really there's an affiliation with that. So all of those variables absolutely are going to make the use of technology something that completely appeals to children. If I then sort of factor in now post-pandemic the frequency with which tech has now become part of education, it's really common now. All through the pandemic, devices were used for online teaching, which was fantastic. It allowed education to continue, and that has now rolled back into classrooms. And as an aid to learning, devices can be absolutely fantastic. A lot of the schools I work with give children devices, their own devices to take home and to use. So the availability, the accessibility, the normalising of all of these things now means that we're not having conversations anymore about whether children will access devices, because it is now an absolute given. What we're now having conversations about is how to manage it, given that it's an inevitability in their childhood.
I'm curious to know, do you think that it's wrong that schools are doing so much of their teaching now using media devices and online? Because I've heard of a few people who have had children sent home because they've actually become addicted to the media devices, and the schools have recognised that this needs to be addressed, but then the child has to be pulled out of school. And that to me seems completely nonsensical.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, as with everything, when something new, we introduce a new concept or a way of working with children and young people, it's really important to think about how we're going to manage that. I always use the example of sugar, which we know is phenomenally bad for our health. And so I say to parents sometimes, would you give unregulated access to sugar in your house? I suspect there is sugar in your house if people have tea or coffee or you bake with it, whatever. But and that seems like a really obvious question to parents. They say, well, no, absolutely not. I was like, okay. And we're not saying that sugar is inherently bad. It's excellent if you're trying to bake something. But we would sort of take a view on the amount or the kind of exposure with that. And I think certainly, I mean, I feel that schools are slightly more aware of this issue now, but I think exactly as you were saying, you know, sort of pre-pandemic, when the rise of devices was around, the approach was not one of how am I going to manage the limits around it? You know, what are the rules going to be? What's going to be the way that we manage this in our house? And I would say, you know, do not bring something into your kind of household, your family, unless you've got a really clear idea what the plan is, who's in charge, who's going to use it. Like, I love the conversation about who owns the device, because young people, you know, very attached to their devices, and they very much say, well, it's my phone. And you think, okay, but who pays the bill? Who has the contract? You know, is it yours? Is it theirs? Who's got the ultimate say and the authority? So I think all of that really needs thrashing out. And as a parent, you've definitely got the authority to do that. When you bring schools into the mix, where's the authority of what the parent can and can't regulate with the device? What controls and parameters do schools have around it? Does the young person have a sense that it's their device and they've got ownership of it? So I think absolutely, and then it's starting to get really complicated then. So I think a lot of work needs to be done. And I certainly see some schools really embracing this. The idea of really clear contracting, really clear limits, parameters, boundaries. And when that's done well, it becomes part of the learning, not only of using a device, but having access to a device, how you're going to manage yourself, how the device is going to be managed, what regulating forces are you going to be able to put in. And if a child is too young to be able to manage that, I think it's absolutely right that we say, actually, this is really hard for you to regulate, and actually maybe now isn't the right time. The problem is schools roll them out at any given age and stage without sort of saying, well, this cohort of children can definitely cope with it, maybe these ones can't, or even within this class these children are ready and these aren't. So I think there's real nuance about how this needs to be approached. And I would completely agree with you. Some schools are really, you know, really on top of that. And for other schools, it's a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's just resources, isn't it, really? Because if you're having to pick out those who are ready and those who aren't within one classroom, I mean, you know, forget it. I mean, we know that it's so overburdened already, the educational system. And it's so hard, and whether one then just delays it until children are, say, in their mid-adolescence, where it should be safe for all of them to be able to approach it in a more boundaried manner. But as you say, I think boundaries are so crucial. And then it goes back to what we were saying about parents who are slightly older, because they're not literate or savvy with these media devices, and therefore installing these boundaries is much, much harder because they don't have a clue these sort of holes that people can go down on social media, whereas say my friends are probably slightly more aware and slightly more literate when it comes to devices.
Absolutely. I mean, that's again that kind of skill gap, isn't it? How do you put apps or controls or limits on devices? I mean, children are like super savvy. They'll get round of those really quickly. And, you know, sometimes I feel like you need to be an IT expert to kind of, you know, work these things. I mean, it's really tricky, and I think it's really sad for parents to feel that they want their child to have something or to use something that might be beneficial. You know, it might be, let's not demonize devices as an aid to learning. There's lots of evidence around kind of digital device learning, and I've been involved in some of that research, and I've done some work with Kinder who are really passionate about digital play as well as physical play. It's a really fascinating topic. And what we know is what we call, it's a lovely phrase, joint media engagement. So looking at devices jointly with a child, sharing media content, discussing, it improves language skills, it improves concentration, it can really develop children's skill sets. There's lots of things that you can do with devices from a digital learning point of view that are really beneficial. So parents absolutely want to access that, and they don't want to feel that their child is not keeping pace with their contemporaries. But then parents feel very worried about how do you regulate the other side of device use, access to social media, access to the entire content of the internet, which the last time I checked was quite a lot of content.
So in your book, you do identify some of the main sort of detrimental effects that the media devices can have on younger children. And would you mind just outlining what those are?
Interestingly, the thing, and this is often what people don't realise, what the research really tells us is one of the big problems with children's device use at a young age is because it competes with other things. It's not the device use in and of itself, it's what they're doing when they're using the device, which means the things that they aren't doing. So typically they aren't moving. So device is quite a static thing to do. You're sitting down or laying down. So they stop moving as much. So there's loads of evidence to say there's a correlation between device use and obesity in children and young people, which is phenomenally bad for their health. And if you're not moving, as well. It links to health indicators, but you're not developing lots of those really important motor coordination skills. So that's another, concerning difficulty, particularly the fine motor skills. So if you think about school readiness, going into school for the sort of the building the skills for writing and those kind of things. And then particularly young children, if they're on a device, the content tends to be what we call passive content. It's delivered to them. Some games and devices are interactive, but a lot of stuff, it will automatically load up the next piece of content that it delivers them. And so it lacks that kind of engaging, interactive process. And it really doesn't provide opportunities for language and for communication development and interacting with others and cooperating and negotiating and all of those skills that you're going to need in the real world, in the playground, building your learning with other people. So what concerns me about children, young children, and even up into latency phase, it is the amount of time they spend on the device is in direct competition with lots of the other things that I would want them to be doing for the breadth of their development.
And you say in your book that actually a lot of children are not going out to play because parents are becoming more and more risk averse, and it's actually a much safer, easier option to allow your children to sit in their bedroom and game away or scroll away on an iPad, because the world is a more dangerous place and more sordid things go on. And therefore, rather than let your children go to the park with their friends, it's like, oh well, I know they're upstairs, I'm working from home, it's an easier option.
Yeah, I think that interesting thing about risk is really fascinating, because certainly parental perception is that it's not safe to have children out of sight. And if I think again that sort of parallel with certainly my generation, my parents' generation, going out to playing locally, all of those things were relatively normal. They are not normal now. So our whole idea around children's play and risk and balancing the sort of pros and cons of exposing children to relative amounts of risk, climbing on dangerous things, using tools like in the garden, or woodworking tools or equipment and things like that. There can be a huge amount of concern. Quite rightly, I definitely don't want children to be harmed. I feel like I need to make that disclaimer. But that risk has to be balanced against kind of gain. And so if you have a perception that the world outside your front door, interestingly, largely driven by the amount of media content that parents access about how safe or not the world is, leads you to have a heightened anxiety about risk. So you keep your children in. That seems to be super logical to me. But what I then find really fascinating is by giving a child a device, you can see them. They're in front of you, so ostensibly they're safe, where they are, but actually you don't know what they're accessing, so you just give them the whole of the internet to kind of roam around. And so it's interesting, we perceive the physical world as unsafe, but the whole of the digital world as relatively safe. And so I just would want parents to balance. There's risk on both sides, right? And so I just would like that weighing up a little bit more. Not that I want to demonize any particular approach, but there are bits about the internet that aren't terribly safe either.
Oh, I mean, it's hugely unsafe. And I think the trouble is, as we've alluded to, you're exposing them to this abyss of endless information, endless stimulation, endless sort of ideas that they're not yet ready to take on board necessarily. So the danger of doing that, rather than simply going to the playground, being in the moment, hopefully playing with a friend, having a social interaction. And this is the other thing that's so terrifying, is that children are losing that ability to interact and to form friendships like we used to in our childhood. And the illusion that they've got all these friends because they've got friends on social media, when in fact they've lost the ability to even make eye contact when they're with people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I think is really fascinating about that is this kind of idea of being always on. Like, I love that analogy of kind of going to the park or even going to school or the playground. You can have an exchange or an interaction with someone, positive or negative or whatever happens, but then you can come away from that, and you can, and the exchange effectively kind of comes to an end. So if that's been a difficult exchange or there's something you're not happy with, you get a bit of respite from that. You can come home. But something about the connectivity of online connections and friendships and relationships, it has that always on quality. There's no kind of respite from that. It can continue when you're at home, when you're out. And so I think about the sort of pressure and the demand of that kind of on young children. So it's something about the intensity of the social connectivity. It's something about the sort of extensiveness, the reach. You open up the whole world, which is amazing, right? You can have a pen pal in New Zealand, but that kind of relatability, that suddenly being, you're exposed to different cultures, which is fabulous. It really broadens your horizons. But that immediate connectivity, that relatable to people in your street, down your road, at your park, like, is opening up the whole world coming at the cost of that? And all of those skills of saying hi to your neighbour as you go down the street, or knowing who are the people that live immediately around you, like, I think we lose some of that immediate community, local support networks, and yet we know it takes a village to raise a child. And so I just kind of really wonder what's happening to our kind of community relationships.
Yeah, and as we know, with the sort of demise of religion, or sort of particularly in Christianity, and where in the UK that was the main religion, certainly like 40, 50 years ago, and the church was something that people did on a regular basis, and that was the community centre, the hub, really. And now that's not the case. So, it's like you say, if you don't have a neighbourhood, if you don't have the interaction with your neighbours, if you don't have the local friends from the playground at school, whatever it is, children are losing something that's just such, to me, it's just an integral part of life. It doesn't feel like a real meaningful friendship conversing by text, or just leaving each other voice notes, or doing things on Snapchat, which it's just... Yeah,
it has that sort of qualitatively different feel, doesn't it? And relationships are so important for children's social and emotional well-being, their social development, that ability to dip in, dip out, connect with other people. And I would not be critical of kind of online relationships and connections. I know that they can be phenomenally important, and people can share some, they're fantastic for sharing common interests, and people can join forums and things where they can absolutely find like-minded people. But I don't want that to be at the cost of having local connections and friendships, interacting in the real world. As it currently stands, we predominantly live in the real world. Mark Zuckerberg and his metaverse has any say on this. That may not be the case going forward, and I don't know if I'll live long enough to see that. But at the moment, those real world skills are still really vital. I know there's a huge amount of working from home and all of those sort of changes to the workplace and changes to education. But I would still say that the vast majority of parents that I meet would say they definitely want their children to have in-person skills, to be able to connect with people, to be able to go into a room, start a conversation, know how to interact and converse. And I think we've really got to kind of hold on to balancing that out for children, to make sure that we really are equipping them for the world and the future ahead of them, whatever that looks like.
And as you were speaking earlier about this sort of constant exposure, having this device, and there's no end, there are no boundaries, there's no just having it in a compartment. It just struck me of, I interviewed a woman called Dr. Anna Lemke, who wrote Dopamine Nation, and we're putting children on this dopamine roller coaster, because the trouble is they're getting all these likes online, and their brains are so overstimulated, or whether it's gaming. It's just that you can see them firing, those neural pathways firing up. So they're constantly seeking these extreme highs. And then we wonder why things like ADHD are on the incline, because, to me, it's a no-brainer. Surely it's completely correlated with the rise in use of media devices.
So, I absolutely understand, that point about the dopamine, and absolutely the research behind that is very clear. All of those, I feel very sad when I realise from a science point of view that a lot of the way that games, social media, all of that, all of the sort of apps and things that we can access are designed around a kind of constant feedback model. So the kind of likes and the thumbs up and the clicks and the hits and the way that it sort of pings, that's been deliberately developed in order to maintain our engagement. The goal of the device is to keep you looped in. That's what it wants. And so I feel very sad when I think about exposing children to that and not equipping them with the skills to be able to disconnect that from that when they need to. And I think that is a genuine kind of source of concern for me. And even as adults, the phenomenon of sort of doom scrolling is not lost on me. It amazes me how quick and easy it is to be kind of sucked into that. I think it gets more complicated when we start talking about different types of neurodivergence and ADHD and autism, and the research on this is less clear. It's certainly not less causal, but I have lots of evidence from my work that devices are an important or an area of particular interest for children with neurodivergence, and so we get into that kind of correlation causation type kind of science. But certainly I think there are additional vulnerabilities amongst certain cohorts of children, whether that be neurodiversity or kind of other factors about them temperamentally, that mean that the device has more attraction and more capacity to become quite a pull, quite a lure, and then it becomes really tricky for them. And absolutely, I spend a lot of my working life talking to parents who are struggling with this.
And maybe I'm being too flippant and sort of ill-informed to be able to sort of, like you said, I think the child has to probably be susceptible already to developing a neurodivergent condition, but I do think that it is interesting how their attention span particularly has just dwindled. I mean, children now, I think the average length of time that they can focus is something, it's under 5 seconds, I think. Yeah,
it's so interesting, because I think sort of scattered attention is really it's a sort of fascinating hot topic, and I work a lot in the field of neurodivergence and with children with ADHD and autism and other sort of developmental difference. And I always think that there are two sides to every attentional conundrum. One is the capacity of the individual to direct and control their attention. And the other side of the coin is what I call the attentional grab, how interesting the thing is that's trying to grab your attention. And I work in a school, I have family members who are teachers, and I really feel for modern day teaching, because it's reasonably difficult for a kind of standard up at the front of the class chalk and talk teacher to be as interesting and attentional grabbing as a device or a game. And I often think if that's what you're in competition with, that's a tough gig, right, as a teacher. And so are we kind of upping the bar on sort of children's expectations of what's going to grab their attention, multi-sensory, lights, noise, pinging, movement, all of that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, for sure, when you're in a classroom looking at a teacher and they're trying to explain a relatively dry concept to you, I think, okay, that's really tough. So if nothing else, we've got to do something about capping the bar on that, because none of us are that interesting.
Yeah, I know. It's terrifying. Why do you think so many parents then are still turning to screens as a quick fix to entertaining their children? Because I think the awareness now is that it is detrimental to hand your kids an iPad at age 4, which it's amazing. You go out and about and you see these children, as you say, it's extraordinary. They're literate on iPads and on phones. They sort of snatch mum's phone, they know the passcode, and it's, why are parents still resorting to it?
So I think that's really, I think it's really interesting to think about what parents feel that they've got at their disposal, what's in their repertoire. I mean, I definitely grew up in an era where I was told too much television was going to give me square eyes. I have no idea where that logic came from, but that's kind of, and now, interestingly, watching people watch TV is a form of entertainment. Like, Gogglebox, it's like so interesting. Like, watching TV would now be seen as quite a kind of social endeavour, as opposed to device using, which is quite kind of individual. So I think what over the years, what messaging have parents been given? You mustn't just plonk your children in front of the TV. It's the digital babysitter. And now we're kind of onto sort of devices. Parents, mustn't use that as a kind of distractor or a kind of broker of time, really. And so I think about the demands on modern parents, what it is they're juggling, what it is that they've got at their kind of disposal. And then I think, okay, parents are going to reach for what's available to them. And I think, does that mean that there's something about the kind of immediacy of children, that they, that kind of instant gratification, or the boredom thresholds are down? And I think parents will go for what works and what's available. If you're juggling demands and you're trying to get something done and you can't give your full attention to your child in that moment, then to have a proxy, a parenting proxy, which is often what they use the digital device for, I can understand it. The difficulty being, once that pattern has been established, both the parent knows that it's available and the child knows that it's available, and you've set up a dynamic then that's quite difficult to unravel.
what would you say to parents if you were to come up with a generic age where it's safe to hand children devices? What would
I get asked this all the time, and quite tellingly, really. Minds far greater than mine still haven't answered this question. So people like the American Pediatric Association, the British Association of Paediatricians, all of these entities, all of these bodies actually have never come up with a definitive age. Interestingly, some countries do. So I believe the research in the book was saying that in countries like Korea, for example, it's written into law you can't give devices to children under a certain age. And I think it's really interesting when even the sort of scientific community is tentative about putting a sort of age stamp on that. I would say to parents that I would flip it round and say, at what age do you think that there is space in your child's development to accommodate a device? So, do you feel that they are, getting enough of all of the other developmental exposures that you want them to have: movement, social interaction, communication, and language? And if you feel that actually, they really are maxed out on all of those things, all of those milestones and developmental things are being met, and devices are being introduced to them as part of their system of education, okay, then that's the point to start having that conversation with yourself. But as a parent, you need to be clear about how that's fitting into your life. What is your plan for that device? How is it going to work? How are you going to integrate it? How are you going to put limits and management around it? What are or aren't you going to accept? What content are or aren't you going to allow your child to be exposed to? And how are you going to monitor that isn't creeping into the other areas of their development? So it's a really weighty decision, I think, at the point at which you feel that your child is ready for that. And often when I sit down with parents and have the conversation around that framework, they've usually got a pretty good idea when they think their child is ready, and it's a lot older than they would have anticipated when we begun the conversation.
You write about addiction in your book, and this rising phenomenon of being addicted to the internet and to media devices. What are the main red flags that a child might be addicted to? And
it's interesting because addiction is such an emotive word, because it's got that resonance with all of the sort of really terrifying things that we think of as adults, the resonance with substances and those kind of things. And what I think of more, addiction is a great headline grabbing word, but I would probably reframe that as kind of dependency. If you feel that there's a sort of intensity or a need or a dependency with your child in relation to that device that's becoming difficult to negotiate, that's becoming at the cost of the other things that we want them to do, then I think that's a clue that it's taking up more space in your child's life and in their developmental journey than it should. And often I can ask parents, and they've pretty quickly got an idea whether that's the case. Is it interfering with family life, with meal times, with studying, with homework, with socializing with friends? Is it becoming a little bit all-consuming? Are you finding yourself as a parent butting up against not your child but your child's device use? And if that's starting to feel like that's a regular daily kind of friction point, then probably, and parents will at that point absolutely readily admit that there's too much of this going on.
I mean, like you said, it's very, very hard for some parents because children become very secretive and quite devious.
Oh, yes.
And so if you were talking to, say, a room full of parents, you said, how can we control or limit the usage of media devices in our home? What would be your advice?
Yeah, and I would definitely think about the sort of age of this. So I think certainly for younger children, it's easier for parents to own the landscape of kind of authority and power. That's relatively easier. So although it might be distressing and uncomfortable to remove access to devices, that's certainly possible when the child is younger. Parents can have greater control over access to the Wi-Fi and access to the sort of connectivity to the net. So I think for a younger child, the conversation is not about whether they can implement it, but their concerns about the distress that will follow and how they'll manage the kind of fallout of that. And we spend a bit of time thinking about how they can help their child cope with that, because it's distressing, I understand. I think it gets really tricky when you get into adolescence, because actually you then, as a parent, really bump up for the first time against the terrifying reality that you might not have as much control over something as you'd like. You can turn the Wi-Fi off, but they'll access the 5G, they'll find a way around it, right? And so in that situation, kind of
raw, hard parental power might not cut it. You know, you can have a disagreement with an adolescent and they'll leave the house and they walk down the street to the park, and then they can access, because they're in the park, and they can access, you know, the internet through their phone's connectivity. So then you need a whole different skill set around negotiation, around limits and boundaries, around sanctions, and it becomes like managing any other behaviour where you've got to kind of agree. And I do mean agree on a rule. It's really difficult to impose a rule with an adolescent, because actually, unless you've got some buy-in, you're going to really struggle. So, you know, what is your agreed rules around this? How are we going to monitor it? And how are we going to manage it if there's sort of drift on what the agreed plan is? And I'd really like to sort of throw something in the mix here, Pandora, because something that I really notice, and I have done a TED talk on this topic, is that one of the things I really want parents to think about is what behaviour they're modelling with device use, right? Because it's really fascinating that we can have lots of rules about how other people behave, but we might not always be living those rules ourselves. So it's all well and good saying, you know, I don't want your device, and, you know, interrupting, and you're always on that. But how many of us have taken a phone call when we're with our kids, or answered a text, or I'm just answering this email, or like, I will be the first to put my hands up. I will be the first to put my hands up and say, there are absolutely times when I have just quickly done something on my laptop or on my phone, and, you know, in front of my children, in a way I think, well, actually they're deserving of my attention in this moment, and this has competed with it. And there is lots of really interesting research about what we call kind of distracted or kind of disrupted attention. So we have parents now who are equally as distracted by their own devices and not giving full attention to their children. And this is, I'm going to share this stat with you because I absolutely adore this. When AT&T, the provider in America, rolled out their network coverage, in each of the areas that they rolled it out to, there was a direct increase in the number of children presenting at A&E with accidents. The assumption being that the parents had been distracted by their devices and their children had come to experience harm or accident or misadventure as a result of that.
No way.
So we've really got to be, when we are doing a lot of the kind of finger pointing and the kind of, you know, device management stuff, I'm very clear, this is a whole house plan. This is not a what you do and what, you know, what I say and what you do. Everybody has to do it. And in our house, you would absolutely be called out if you were, you know, looking at your phone and not really giving someone attention or not really listening. You know, it's really kind of phone down. You're trying to talk to me about something. Okay, I'm listening. I'm turning that off. No phones at the table. Like, all of those kind of stuff applies to everybody. And I think if you start modelling that really clearly, you are on much stronger ground to then try and impose some of those expected rules and standards with your own kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a valid point, and I think the trouble is that so many people sort of are now speaking more about workaholism and, you know, being able to be, I guess, accessed 24/7, and because it's work, it's deemed as it's okay. Yeah. Well, it's okay, fine, I'll send the email, or I better pick up the phone because it's a colleague. And actually, as you say, it's that thing of modelling behaviour that you want your children to follow, and children are very, very receptive to picking up on what their parents do, and equally I would then say, particularly children who are neurodivergent, mirroring is like a massive part of that. And actually, we really need to start modelling the behaviours that we want our children to follow.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely, I mean, it's so fascinating, and I completely agree. And it's the sort of little everyday rules. It's, you know, we are all susceptible to being enticed and distracted and lured away from the sort of immediate real world by our devices, whether that be I just need to check my emails, or I just need to send a message, or I just need to check something, or I just need to pick up this call. So the way that we kind of model that for our children, and I'll give you a lovely example. So I do feel like I spend a fair amount of my life ferrying my children around, and whoever gets to ride shotgun, whoever gets to come in the front, it's a really clear rule that you don't get to be on your phone. Well, firstly, I'm not allowed to be on my phone, so you shouldn't be allowed to be on yours because I'm the one driving. And secondly, this is not an Uber. And if you would like to use your phone, which I can respect, then public transport is freely available, and you may ignore your fellow passengers at will. But not in my car. We're going to have an enforced conversation, which you will enjoy. And then they're allowed to make a decision. If they'd like to ask for a lift, they know the rules that go around that. If they would like to get public transport, they know the rules that go around that. I can't not stop them being on their phone on the bus. I can stop them being on their phone in my car. And it's just like, it's those kind of, what are the rules for your family about how you're going to manage this, you know, extra member of the family that's come on in.
I love that. It's brilliant. I'd love to just talk about cyberbullying, because that again is becoming a bit more of an issue and it's being spoken about more in the press. What do you think parents can do to protect their children from cyberbullying? And if they suspect a child is being bullied online, what can they do?
Yeah, so for me, this is about communication. This is about really keeping the channels of communication open with your child, encouraging them to speak up the minute that they feel uncomfortable, the minute that something doesn't feel right, to be able to step away, to be able to come and alert you. There is so much that adults, teachers, parents, authority figures can do to assist, but young people get so worried, so concerned, so locked in and caught up in it that they feel that they can't tell anyone, or that no one's going to understand, or no one's going to help, or this hasn't happened to anybody else. And so my absolute resounding message all the time is young people to speak up, and parents to be able to listen and to make it really clear. And I often say this to my own children: I want to know that they can tell me something. Now, I am not promising that I am not going to be cross or shout about that. It seems inevitable. They know me well enough. I would also like to think that they know me well enough that when I've finished huffing and puffing and shouting, that I am on their side, that I will find a solution and I will pursue it until that this is resolved. And I think it's about being really honest and having that conversation with your children. You know, they need to know that they can come to speak to people. If they are worried about talking to adults, you should also make them absolutely aware of all the other places that they can go to get information. So I love the NSPCC resources that they put out there. Their website is amazing. It gives children links to lots of other people that they can talk to. It doesn't matter who you tell, just tell somebody. That will start the ball rolling to get this sorted. And I want that message to be on every parent's lips all of the time. If there's anything you're worried about, can you tell someone? Do you know who to tell? Do you know how you would do that? I'd really love it if you could tell someone. It doesn't matter if it's not me, just speak out for somebody.
What would you say are the main signs that a child might be being bullied online?
Similar to the signs if a child's being bullied in person. You know your child well, you can tell if their mood seems to be dipped, there's changes in their behaviour, they're not eating as well, they're not sleeping, they seem more distressed, they're more easily distressed about things, their sort of emotions are closer to the surface, they're spending more time away from you, they seem to be really preoccupied, they seem to be wanting to have often young people might, I mean, in really disturbing cases of bullying, the greatest difficulty is that you're not telling anybody, but often they might tell their peers, or their peers might have a sense of what's going on, so you notice more kind of conversations amongst peer groups, and just as a parent you just get a sense of there's something going on here and I'm on the outside of it.
So say a parent has a daughter, let's call her Amy, and Amy is a really precocious 14-year-old, and the parents are just, she's very willful and she's got attitude, she's in the sort of midst of her adolescence, and they're terrified of confronting her about her phone use. She's overusing social media, she's always on her phone. What would you say to the parents? How can they create boundaries, especially at that age where they're on the cusp of that independence that you spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love Amy, can I just say? I feel like she's my spirit animal. Yeah, I mean, that's a very tricky but very relatable everyday kind of conundrum. And so I think this is where it's really important to go head to head with a device in a sort of, head-on battle, a sort of direct competition, probably isn't going to end well. With the best will in the world, parents might not be as interesting or as exciting or as relatable as the kind of device, right? So I wouldn't pitch myself that battle. What I would do is I might be a bit more stealth about it. I might try and trade on the relationship that I had with Amy already. So I might find excuses to spend more time with her, to do more things, to sort of put barriers in the way that sort of compete with the device. So I might find excuses to encourage her to come and do things with me, or to go out and about, or to keep her occupied, to play to her other areas of interest outside of devices, and to really kind of leverage against that, really compete on the time scale of that, and just find whether they might be interested in cooking. It's reasonably difficult to look at TikToks, whilst you're also baking a cake, or to go out and about, leave the phones at home, or to go and do. It's quite hard to swim with a phone in your hand. I've just, like, how creative can you get at finding things that you could be doing with your child that kind of compete? Going to the cinema, I mean, the last time I checked, it's a long time since I've been, but people tend not to be on their phones in the cinema. So that's what can I do that just captures back a bit of my child against the phone. Yeah. And so, because parents really are always tempted to go in with the sort of stick, not the carrot. You know, let's start putting rules around this. You've got to be off the phone by this time. And that escalates in one direction only. So I'm not saying definitely don't have some kind of rules and limits, but I would start with the relationship building first, get some of that positivity in, because then you've got something to trade against. Then you've got some goodwill in the bank. And then it's really sensible to follow that up with, this is what I've noticed. This is what I'm a bit concerned about. For these reasons, I mean, state your case. You know, it's interfering with your schoolwork. It's interfering with family relationships. I don't think it's helping your mood and well-being. So therefore, these are the things in relation to the device that I would like to suggest we have in place. But the groundwork is really important before you go in with that. And definitely firm but fair, state your case gently, because nuclear is only going to go one direction.
This has been such a fruitful, fascinating conversation, and I could go on for hours, but I don't want to take up any more of your very generous time that you've already given us. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I really recommend Parenting Unplugged to every listener, particularly parents, but I think it's actually equally fascinating for non-parents like me. And thank you so much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Pandora. I could talk about this and kids all day, so it's been a delight to be able to share some of my ideas.